Scripture today is Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth.
Tell me something. Would it make any difference in the sporting world if we declared all the rules in the various sports is nothing more than suggestions and rough outlines on how to play the game? Would that make any difference? What, for example, if in a golf tournament you hooked the key drive out of the bounds into the water and you said, "Oops, I'm not going to count that one," and put another one up and tee off again, and not count any strokes. "I'm going to take a do-over, a mulligan, but no strokes." Or what about the girl who just finished to become the first girl in Minnesota to jump over 20 feet? Did you know that had just taken place in the last few weeks? There was an article on her in the newspaper. And if Paul and I have got the pictures right, her mother, who still holds the state woman's long jump record in, I think it's South Dakota, is one of Kevin's teachers in the triple jump. But this girl has been striving for it and finally jumped over 20 foot. She went 21 inch and 1/2. Now what would happen to that marvelous record if in the next jump a girl decided, "Well, I've got to get out there further than her, so I'll just scratch by 2 feet, and we'll count it a good jump, and now I've got the record." Now would that be fair? Or what about the football team who decided when they failed to convert on the 4th down that they were just going to take another down? That way they could move down the field. Or if you were playing basketball and you were bringing up the ball up the court like, now my name's gone, Connor does all the time, and they collapse in on you, and you pick up your dribble, you lower your shoulder and drive through them, and then pick up the dribble on the other side. Well, if these are suggestions and not rules, why can't we just do it that way? I remember the year I played football. During a downpour, our coach had us put on all of our gear, helmets, everything, and put on our tennis shoes, and we went to the gym. He divided us up into teams, and he says, "Anything goes. Your goal is to score as many baskets as you can with the football." And he threw it out into the middle of us. It was chaos. He said, "The only thing you can't do is you can't punch, you can't bite, you can't do things like that. But everything else goes." And it was rough. I think it lasted 5 minutes before he decided that wasn't a good idea, because he wasn't going to have a team left to play in a few days if he continued that way. When we don't have rules, it's chaos. Good rules are necessary to allow us to have competitive sports. Following the rules makes all the difference. And you've always got an arbitrator too that holds a big play in it. Like the umpires in a softball game, even the ones that make poor call, they are the ultimate decision makers. And what they say is going to be what is followed. And likewise, there are also rules for living. Now, those we may not like quite as well. There are rules and laws, for example, that have been passed by our nation that have to be obeyed. If you decide you want to do a cannonball run from the west to the east coast and are driving across country at 200 miles an hour, I doubt if you're going to make it a long way before you get pulled over and probably thrown in jail for the reckless endangerment of people's lives. You know, a lot of we can't just go out and rob a store and say, hey, there's no rules. We can do what they want. There are rules we have to follow. Some might call that good citizenship. Both in sports and in life, even if you don't know the rules or misunderstand the rules, they are still going to be applied, and you are going to have to suffer the consequences of your actions or of your disobedience. You are responsible to understand the consequences no matter what. And that kind of brings me to what I want us to think a little bit about today. Does it make any difference what you believe as long as you call yourself a Christian? This question can apply to morality, that is, being in conformity to the conduct or the rules of right conduct, or it can be applied to the belief system, which of itself, if you believe certain things, it leads you to a code of conduct, a morality that is demonstrated in our lives. Too often we find, and I'll call them so-called Christians, who have bought into the system of the world's morality, which gives us very shaky ground to stand on when you stop and think about it, instead of God's morality. In America today, there's a constant conflict between morality based on God's standards and the push by Satan. An example of that conflict could be Franklin Graham recently ripping the NFL Patriots for sponsoring the Gay Bowl 17. He said, I am disappointed that a great team from such a wonderful area of the country would promote a sinful lifestyle like this. Shame on them. And you know, I agree with him totally. That's one of the reasons I have a lot of problem anymore following the NBA, the WNBA, and people that know me know I used to be an avid fan of those sports. But because of their stands on a lot of accepting of immorality in our nation, I have trouble watching them. NFL, same thing. They have a blatant support for alternate lifestyles. And the definition of an alternate lifestyle is living in sin according to God. It's that simple. And by the way, there's a couple scriptures that clearly label it that way. You know, even today, I feel sorry for a lot of kids that are attending schools because of the actions that are being taken. Just the last day or two, I read an article about it's a school out in the east, somewhere around the Washington, D.C. area, that is having trouble now because they've got 5 or 6 families suing the school because their children's privacy is being invaded by other people in the locker room. One boy that started it said he was getting dressed for gym, got down to his underwear, and his friends were going like this, and he turns around and looks, and here's a girl behind him with nothing on. But she had decided that day that she was going to be a man instead of a woman, so she used the men's locker room. And they come to find out, because of the stand that school has taken, this is happening all the time, and kids' privacy is being invaded by the school and by their friends. Just recently, I think I read it this morning, on the somewhere out on the East Coast, I think, or West Coast, I think this one is, where a girl's parents are at odds with the school board because a girl took a picture of her going to the bathroom under the stall and put it on as Facebook or Twitter or something like that. And they're saying that could very easily, it's traumatized the girl because everything she's got has been shown to everybody in the school. And she's been bullied by this girl. You know what the school fined the girl for? 3-day suspension for doing something like that to somebody else. You know how long she served? 1 day. You know why? Because they had an athletic event coming up the next day, and she was one of their star athletes. And you have to be in school that day in order to play the sport. So they suspended her sentence so she could go ahead and play in the games. And so one girl is traumatized and continues to be, while the others are holding up the one that participated and caused the problem. We've got a lot of problems in our world today because of the lack of morality, because we are trying to redefine lifestyles. Our last president was terrible at this, trying to define our lifestyles, and lifestyles that are clearly labeled sin that would not have been tolerated in past are now part of it. And I think that's why Jesus asks what I think is still one of the most haunting questions that is ever asked in the Scriptures. It says, "And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now shall not God bring about justice for his elect, who cry to him day and night, and he will not delay long over them? I tell you, he will bring about justice for them speedily. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" It's a rhetorical question that demands the answer no. He's going to find very little faith left on the earth. In this passage, Jesus speaks of judge, such as the one on the West Coast who has made so many bad decisions recently, or the Fourth Circuit Court, who have ignored even the Constitution and the law to make their decisions. Decisions they want to make on how they feel and how they think it should be, regardless of what our Constitution says, regardless of what the law says. Courts are no longer being held or called into account for the decisions they made. And part of this, of course, goes back to the fact that in the last administration, they did away with requirements in the Senate for how many people you had to have to put a person on a court like this to make become a federal justice. And the reason they've just flooded the courts with people, justices, that have no sense of biblical morality, no sense of even our own Constitution and what is going on and what it says. But many of the decisions being made in courts in America today are rulings against God and against his standards, the standards he has set for his people. The pressures on Christianity, as well as watered down biblical morality, failure to follow or believe God's rules, reaches the place where Jesus expresses when he returns, there's going to be very little faith left. And that's something that haunts me as I think about it day in and day out. And I know other ministers are dealing with the same heartaches that I feel sometimes. We have relinquished God's standards for the world's standards. Does it make any difference what you believe as long as you call yourself a Christian? If you have compromised God for the world, what do you think is going to happen in the end when Jesus returns? Remember this. What I think, what you think is irrelevant. It's what God has said that counts. Ultimately, I'm not going to make the decision. You're not going to make the decision. God's going to make the decision as to whether you are following his standards that he set up for your life and for what you do. The implication and judgment is clearly stated in Matthew 7:22 and 23. It says, "Many shall say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, in your name perform many miracles?" In other words, people are going to say to Jesus on Judgment Day, haven't we done all these great things for you? We've been teachers, we've been pastors, we've been youth workers, we've done all these great things for you. We've went to the hospitals, we've done this. And you know what Jesus said? He says, I will declare unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. He's saying this, very simple. A lot of people who think they're working hard for the Lord, he's going to cast out because their standards have been what they think and not what God thinks. So I think God gives us in the Scriptures what he really thinks is important for our living and for our belief systems. Even what we call doctrine, what we believe God has instructed, has a bearing on our position for the Lord. And this morning I want to begin by taking you back, a little journey way back to the early days of mankind's existence, about 2,000 years after the beginning. If you remember your charts that you made, we're talking about right after the time of Noah, or maybe 1,000 years after the beginning. After Noah, remember, God destroys everything. He looks out and he says, I'm tired of the people. They don't worship me anymore. They don't believe in me. They're doing their own thing. Everybody's doing their own thing. And he says, I'm going to destroy it all. And he did, with water in a flood. And I want to take you back to the time right after that happened, the first probably 100 or 200 years after that. The world is being repopulated. And it's a story of a man named Nimrod. You ever have anybody call you a Nimrod? Well, this is a story of where Nimrod, that name, comes from. It says, this is Genesis 10. Don't believe what you see with your eyes. It's Genesis 10, 8 through 11. It says, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. Cush, by the way, is the son of Ham. Okay, who's Ham? You had Ham, Shem, and the three sons of Noah. Ham is the one that sinned when his dad got drunk. And so his son is Cush. Now Cush becomes the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. At the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From the land he went forth into Assyria, and he built Nineveh. So this is a man, there was several other cities there at Nineveh too. Here is a man who built a kingdom. And it's important to see these passages together with what we read earlier about the Tower of Babel, because they connect. The one that was in charge of that whole operation was Nimrod. And we also need to realize that after the flood, what did God command Noah's family? If you go back to Genesis 9:1, it says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Okay, what he intended was for the people to scatter out across the face of the earth and to populate the world. It was never to gather together and become a central influence and over your people's, your community's life. and to build societies the way that mankind has done. I think it was Thomas Jefferson once said that everybody should live on farms, that the cities would be the ruin of people. And basically that's what is going on here. You're having a city being built instead of people going out into the world. These people had another idea. They said, we're going to build ourselves a city. We're going to develop our own society. And when that happens, people start setting the rules instead of God setting the rules. One of the advantages America had from the beginning is we set many of our rules and our laws were established on biblical principles. Now you talk to the liberals today and they'll say, oh no, we never had many biblical influence on America, but they did from the very beginning. And if you want a book, I've got a book that's about 1,000 pages or more about all the influence that the Bible played in the early life of America. But these people had another idea. We're going to develop our own culture, our own set of rules. We're going to set up our own defenses. Perhaps their idea in making a tower was to make them safe in case another flood came. You ever stop and think about that? Their families, that's back in the early history of their families, not just a couple generations ago, and they may say, well, maybe what we need to do is build a tower to reach up to God, basically, they said, or up into the heavens, so they could be like gods. But their idea may have been to keep them safe from another flood. They refused, in other words, to believe in the rainbow that God had sent to promise them that there would never be a flood like that again. But they refused to trust God. Solomon, I think, brings forth the fault in their reasoning. And we've got a song that's based on this, what Solomon says, in Proverbs 18 and verse 10. It says, the name of the Lord is what? A strong tower. You know what that's a reference to? Probably the Tower of Babylon. He's saying the Tower of Babylon doesn't mean anything. God is our strong tower. The righteous run into it and it is safe. We run to God, and that's the only place we have any safety. In the world around us today, God is the only place where we are safe. Now, we think we've developed a great society, and we're safe in that society, but more and more we're realizing that we aren't. And their attempt to bring a society together to be strong, to make a name for themselves, that desire that they had backfired big time. Because God confused their languages and they scattered across the face of the earth then. But that man leading this process was Nimrod, Ham's grandson. His name means rebellious panther, or we will revolt. And we don't understand that a lot of times. It gives us a hint about his relationship with God. I've discussed this before in sermons, so we're just going to touch on some of the basic facts to remind you of what is here, and we're going to draw some emphasis from it. But the idea that he is a mighty hunter might not be what you may think it implies. Basically, he founded the first kingdom that we ever had, following the flood anyway. We had the kingdom that he established, the kingdom of Babylon and Syria. Both are part of that first kingdom that he established. You know what another name for Nimrod became? Marduk. You know what Marduk was? He was the Babylonian sun god. One of the purposes of the tower, which purpose was to set up Nimrod to be worshipped by the people around him. He gathered together. He was the big shot. He wanted to be worshipped. How often do you see politicians that set themselves up higher than anybody else? That's basically kind of what Nimrod was. By the strength of his power, he was setting up himself as the sun god. By the way, you know what his wife's name was? What? Close. It was Queen Semiramis, which the Jewish people knew her and called her the Queen of Heaven. And it's spoken about, I'm not going to look it up, in Jeremiah 44, 19, or 17 through 19, if you know where it was. And her name, basically, if you go back, it says they built the city to make a name for themselves. Name there means Sem. And that is the basis of Semiramis. She was part of making a name for themselves. In some for the children of Israel, they spoke of her as the Queen of Heaven. And by the way, this is a condemnation of her in Jeremiah 44, because instead of lifting prophets like Jeremiah, they were listening and giving sacrifices and things to the Queen of Heaven, who another name was Ashtaroth. That's the same thing. And they come down through history. You can follow these names. Now, the interesting thing is she had a son. His name was Tammuz. Or Tammuz. It's found in Ezekiel 8:14. It talks about the people crying over him. They were worshiping him also. The interesting thing about him is Semiramis claimed to have given virgin birth to this son. And this is the first time in history you find gods being arranged as a triad. It was in ancient Babylon that they began to put gods together in that way. And this was their first godhead that was established. And the ziggurat that you see now, you don't see the top of this, but usually on the top of every ziggurat there was a little temple. And that temple was dedicated to Ashtaroth, to Marduk, and to Tammuz. That's the idea of it. And you'll find as you go down through history, most ancient religions followed that same practice. And I think you need to note that Constantine, who made the final decision that brought the church to the Trinity, for example, Constantine was not a Christian when he made that decision. He worshiped the sun god again, this time in Rome it was called Sol. But that's who he worshiped. And he's the one that made the final decision. If you ever read about what happened at their Nicaea, when it was all put together, they had the two groups there that were discussing the various ideas. And Constantine wanted to get the Christians together to serve the basis of his kingdom, because he was becoming the emperor. And so he decided, I've got to keep these people together, so we're going to make a decision. He walks into the room and he says, okay, this sounds more like what I've been told over the years, from these pagan religions. This is what we're going to believe and follow from now on. And that's what happened. So basically, sometimes when we're worshiping a God put together like this, we're worshiping a God that came through us through ancient cultures instead of the God that comes through us through the Bible and through Judaism. The tower was the temple to worship these three. God's reaction was, because they were creating a false religion in opposition to Yahweh, his reaction was not good. He was unhappy. They were striving for men's spiritual lives, is what they were doing. And God didn't like that, so he scattered men about. Now think about this a little bit. If it doesn't matter what we believe, it doesn't matter whether it's intentional or not, we choose sometimes to follow ancient religions instead of responding to God's effort to reach us through Judaism. Judaism as a nation was set up with one important principle, and that principle was the unity of God. or the oneness of God. The most important commandment. You remember there was a time when a teacher of law approached Jesus. And he asked Jesus, he says, what is the greatest law? Basically saying, what is the most important thing in our faith that we need to believe? And Jesus answered, and he said this to him. It's in Matthew 22. He said, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. Basically, Jesus said, we are to pour out our entire lives into worshiping Yahweh. Not just by word, but by our lives. You know, what comes out of our mouth in words and praise to God is important. But it means absolutely nothing to God if our lives don't correspond to that worship, dedicated to that. And of course, for those that are well acquainted with the scripture, you know that what Jesus is saying goes back to Deuteronomy 6:4, which is the Shema. It's the most important tenet of the Jewish faith. And it says this, their fundamental belief was based on God's commandment, and God's commandment was this. He says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Let me translate that for you. Just take a couple of words and put the right, correct thing in it. You see, the Jews used the word Lord because they didn't use God's proper name. What he says is, hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. One is the primary number of the Hebrew language. It means he stands alone, he's simple, he's unique from everybody else, but he stands alone. And that's why the Jewish people can't accept the God that many Christians worship today. They understand where it came from. And it's the foundation of their faith that God is one. And that was the foundation that Jesus followed also. Jesus fully understood this teaching. In John 14:28, he says, you have heard how I said unto you, I go away and come again unto you. If you love me, you would rejoice. Because I say, I go to my Father. And he says, my Father is greater than I am. So Jesus is saying, I'm going to go to Yahweh, my Father. And you should rejoice in that because I'm going to the source of all the strength and the power that I have. Philippians talks about having a humble attitude, but it says this about Jesus. It says, having this attitude in yourself, which is also in Christ Jesus, who although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as a thing to be grasped. You know, we all exist in the form of God. That's how we were created when he formed us out of the dust of the ground. We exist in the form of God. But equality with God is not something that we should want. In other words, we seek equality with God when we decide, I'm going to do it this way because this is the way I want to do it. Instead of saying, God, what is the way you want me to do it? And there is a big difference in that in our lives. Jesus, we know, eventually was exalted to the right hand of God because of his willingness to do what God asked him to do. I want you to think about what was also said by John, who, you recall who John is? John's the one that was the apostle who was probably the closest to Jesus Christ. And this is what John tells us in 2 John 2:9. Well, 2 John 1:9. It says, if anyone who goes too far and does not abide the teaching of Christ, it does not have God. And the one who abides in the teaching, he has both the Father and the Son. And if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house. Do not give him a greeting, for the one that gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. Now, what does that tell us about the inclusiveness that our society preaches constantly today? John is saying if you don't accept the Shema that Jesus taught, then we are apart from God. And if we pronounce a blessing on those people, we are participating in their teachings. It seems harsh, considered everything we're taught today about inclusiveness. So I wonder, has God changed his mind about all this? John wrote under the inspiration of God. And God says, it's in Malachi 3:6, it says, "For I am the Lord, I do not change. I am Yahweh, I do not change." And so if we believe God has changed to become more inclusive, what are we saying about God? And you know, one of the things that we had is Israel had a problem, much like we have today, and much like others do. We tend to worship all kinds of things. The worship of Semiramis and Tammuz were at one point the reason God sent them into captivity, because they were going back to the ancient gods instead of the one true God. And God labeled that, of course, in the scripture as adultery. Not being true to him. Something we forget a lot of times is God is a very jealous God. Exodus 20 verse 5 says, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven or on the earth or beneath or in the waters or under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on their children." Exodus 34, verse 14 says, "For you shall not worship any other God, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." And Deuteronomy 4, verse 24 says this, "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." You know, we could continue on and on about this aspect of God. Now, let me preface my conclusion with something. I am very thankful to God that I'm not the one who in the final day is going to have to sit in judgment. Because I just don't think I could do it. And I'm not trying to make any judgment here. However, I challenge you to consider this. Does it matter what you believe? I doubt if any of us would intentionally march up all those steps to get to the top to worship Marduk. But again, do we? By the way, Babylon, which means we look at it as babbling, that's where we get that from, also meant, in their language, it meant gate of God. They went up to the gate of God to worship. But it wasn't to worship the one God, but it was to worship Marduk. How important is it to understand that God is one? Well, if we really believe the teachings of Shema, you would understand that to depart that teaching can easily lead to split loyalties between the gods of this world and Almighty God. That's what happened to Israel. That's why they went into captivity. That's why they were in and out of favor with God throughout all the Old Testament. It is because they kept accepting the gods of around them instead of the one God and being obedient unto him. When we give ourselves totally to Yahweh, because he is the only ruler of the universe, when we give our tithes totally over to him, that drives our lives. It is turning over our will to him in everything that we say and do. Does it matter? Well, let me just say this. I know I don't want to be on the wrong side of a jealous Yahweh.